Hello, welcome to today's panel on decentralized ledgers. My name is Nina Toft Djanegara, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm a PhD student in anthropology here at Stanford University, where I also serve as the program fellow in the CCSRE Race and Tech Lab. I'd like to introduce our three panelists and thank them for coming today. We have Professor Bill Maurer, who is a cultural anthropologist and socio-legal scholar with expertise in emerging alternative and experimental forms of money, payment technologies, and their legal implications. His research on blockchain technology and the law has been supported by a grant from the National Science Foundation. He is a professor with joint appointments in anthropology, law, and criminology, law and society, at the University of California, Irvine, where he also serves as the Dean of the School of Social Sciences and the Director of the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion. Bill received his BA from Vassar College and his MA and PhD from Stanford. We also have Elizabeth Renieris, who is a data protection and privacy lawyer, a practitioner fellow at Stanford's Digital Civil Society Lab, and a professor of practice at the University of Notre Dame. She is also a Technology and Human Rights Fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Her work focuses on cross-border data governance frameworks, as well as the ethical challenges and human rights implications of digital identity, blockchain, and other emerging technologies. Elizabeth holds a Master of Laws from the London School of Economics, a Juris Doctorate from Vanderbilt University, and a BA from Harvard College. And last but not least, we have Dr. Kortney Ziegler, who is an award-winning entrepreneur who has built a number of solution-driven products focused on providing support for the Black diaspora. He is the creator and co-founder of Apolition, a crowdfunding platform for bail philanthropy, and TransHack, a nonprofit dedicated to developing technology for the transgender community. He currently helps others learn and understand the cryptocurrency market through the educational platform Green Kandle Academy, and he's working on building a new decentralized lending platform that leverages blockchain. He holds a PhD in African American Studies from Northwestern University, and he's also a current practitioner fellow with Stanford's CCSRE Race and Tech initiatives. So welcome to Bill, Elizabeth, and Kortney. Thank you for coming today. So to get us started, I'd like to lay out some key concepts for the discussion today, just to make sure that all of us are on the same page. So to start us off, Bill, could you explain what do we mean when we say blockchain and give us a brief introduction of what the technology is and how it works?
Thanks, Nina. I'll do my best. Blockchain is essentially just a accounting device. So imagine for a minute a ledger, an actual ledger book or an accounts book that you would have in a bank where transactions are recorded. In a traditional ledger, you have some sort of central accounts keeper, the banker, who's the one who gets to make the entries into that ledger whenever anyone posts a transaction at the bank. Now, in blockchain, instead of having one ledger sitting in a central place with one central accounts keeper, imagine that you make a whole bunch of identical copies of that accounts book and give a copy to everybody in town. And whenever anyone wants to post a transaction to the ledger, you tell everyone, and then everyone engages in a sort of game to verify that transaction before it's posted to the ledger, and then everybody's ledger gets updated all at once. So it's essentially a distributed and decentralized way of recording transactions and really, think of it as sort of recording provenance or chain of custody of transactions that's collaboratively maintained by all the nodes in the network that participate in it. We can talk about the sort of problems that solves, especially when you're trying to track digital objects of value or chain of custody of ownership, which is what it was designed for. And we can also talk about sort of the theory versus the practice, because I've just described it as, a distributed, decentralized kind of thing. But over time, at least in some cryptocurrency spaces, transaction verification has become more and more and more centralized. But at its base, if you don't know anything about blockchain, think of that account book at a bank in the Old West or something, and then make lots and lots of copies of it, give it to everybody in the town, and make responsibility for verifying transactions the responsibility of everyone.
Okay, great. Thank you. So hopefully the title Decentralized Ledgers makes a little bit more sense now. The most famous and first application of blockchain is Bitcoin, that most of the audience members are probably familiar with. But Kortney, can you give us some more background on cryptocurrency overall? And beyond just the technical, what kinds of aspirations about the future are bound up in the promotion of crypto?
Yeah, definitely. So thanks for the explanation of blockchain, Bill, because it's going to lead into my talk about cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is basically electronic digital money designed using cryptographic techniques. So it provides and facilitates secure transactions, but it also uses blockchain technology to manage and record these transactions on a public ledger. So that's essentially what cryptocurrency is. Perhaps the most popular cryptocurrency and the most famous one that we know of is Bitcoin. And I would argue right now Dogecoin with Doge Mania, everybody went crazy and either lost some money or made a lot of money. But Bitcoin is probably the most well-known cryptocurrency that exists, but it is not the first. There was other attempts at developing digital currencies that are powered by cryptographic technologies prior to Bitcoin in the early 90s. One of the most successful, I think, was DigiCash. It actually went bankrupt, but it was essentially a way for people to send fiat money, but you had to use a particular software that created encryption keys that the receiver needed to have in order to facilitate this exchange of money. It didn't succeed because it was prior to like e-commerce on the internet. And so, which is why I think cryptocurrency right now is in some ways as popular as it is, because it really gets us to think about web transactions in a different way. So DigiCash wasn't successful, went bankrupt, got bought by another e-cash payment platform. PayPal came out with web facilitated digital payments, which really then I argue kind of sparks a future thought into digital payments, such as crypto. In 2009, a group of developers or one person, we don't really know, Satoshi Nakamoto created Bitcoin as a response to bailing out banks and really wanted to provide a way for people to have peer-to-peer sending money in a decentralized way without utilizing a third-party figure. So right now, there are thousands of cryptocurrencies. We can all make our own cryptocurrency because of Ethereum, but there are thousands of cryptocurrencies and they're not necessarily always used in exchange for goods, but a number of them are. But a number of them are used, which I'm excited to talk about later, in really, really awesome ways to kind of redistribute wealth. Some folks are kind of thinking of that. But yeah, cryptocurrency are used in video games, growing virtual worlds, and even payment processors such as PayPal and Venmo are allowing people to purchase Bitcoin, which is interesting though, because Bitcoin isn't really used as a peer-to-peer money exchange. It's primarily used as a store of value asset. So people are buying Bitcoin because they hope it gets increases in value, where they're not necessarily using it for the technology. So we can talk about that too, but that's kind of an overall general of what cryptocurrency is.
Great, thank you. I do think that when we originally planned this panel, it might have been before the big spike in Dogecoin, but I guess this has become even more timely. So Elizabeth, can you move on to speaking about an application of blockchain that is growing, but probably less familiar to the general public? So how does blockchain relate to digital identity, and what's at stake really when people's identities are put into a blockchain ledger?
Yeah, thanks, Nina. Firstly, thank you for having me. This is a really remarkable conference, so it's just an honor to be part of it. I think the introductions provided by both Bill and Kortney are really useful in this regard. And it's really important as we dive into this conversation about blockchain and identity to sort of keep in mind that blockchain is primarily a financial or accounting technology, and that the primary use case has been cryptocurrencies and financial transactions. But when we think about this question of identity or digital identity, I think of two sort of primary dimensions to the identity piece of the conversation. The first is the more obvious, which is the sort of transactional identities needed to do something with a given ledger. So whether it's Bitcoin or any other ledger. And typically this is in the form of an address, like a Bitcoin address, which you might be familiar with, which is effectively a pseudonymous public address, basically just a string of alphanumeric characters associated with a private key. And so this is the sort of nature of identity needed to participate in various transactions or interactions. And one thing we know quite well now is that the vast majority of these transactions and these identities are quite easily correlatable with real world identities. And so a lot of the sort of initial excitement around the potential for things like anonymous transactions and privacy enhancing transactions has actually proven to be not quite the case. And I'm sure we'll dive more deeply into that. But the dimension that I think it's more important to focus on in the context of this conference and this panel is digital identity as actually a use case for blockchain or decentralized ledger technology. So just as cryptocurrencies are, a use case or one way of sort of leveraging the underlying technology, digital identity has emerged really since about, I would say, 2016, 2017 as another potential use case. And there are many permutations of this use case, including in different kinds of applications in different sectors and different contexts, and in terms of how it's implemented. So there's really no uniform consensus around what we mean by sort of blockchain-enabled or blockchain-based digital identity. However, there are streams of consensus emerging. So for example, when I first started working on blockchain-related matters with respect to digital identity around 2015 and 2016, there were many projects that were really interested in storing identity credentials, so things like digital forms of passports or driver's licenses or other identity credentials, banking credentials, directly on ledgers, on distributed ledgers, on blockchains. As someone who's trained as a data protection and privacy lawyer, I quite quickly was really concerned about some of these use cases and applications. And a consensus sort of quickly emerged between 2016 and 2018, which is when Europe's General Data Protection Regulation was adopted and came into force around the specific privacy and data protection related concerns and tensions in some of these use cases. And so by 2018, there was really a shifting consensus that you shouldn't actually be storing identity credentials or digital documents on ledgers or on the blockchain, so to speak, but that you would actually leverage the underlying technology in a different way. So today, I would say when you hear about sort of an identity-related blockchain project, the project is typically or most likely using the ledger for two different things. Firstly, what we call decentralized key management. So this isn't really different from traditional key management, but it's decentralized because it's leveraging this underlying decentralized ledger. And the other that's very typical is things like a revocation registry, which is basically enabling a party to determine whether an identity-related credential is valid or whether it's been revoked. For example, whether it's expired, if it's something like a digital license of some kind. So I think it's important to separate the two dimensions, the transactional and the sort of the use case, the functional. But it's also important to note that both of these dimensions have social, political, and equity dimensions built into them. And both of them have those types of concerns. But I would say the bigger concerns, again, in the context of this particular panel and conference, come in with respect to the use case. And it's really, again, it's important to keep in mind this sort of financial accounting nature of the underlying technology, because at the end of the day, whether the use case is digital identity or anything else, the decentralized ledger is effectively just a record of transactions. And when you reduce something like identity to a record of transactions, and when you reduce identity to a fundamentally transactional technology, you start to get into a lot of socio-technical problems, if you will, and there's an inherently problematic framing around it. So I know we'll dive deeper into all of this, but that's sort of the overview of how blockchain digital identity are related.
Great, thank you. It's certainly ironic that at this moment in which our society is having a greater appreciation for the richness and nuance of social identity, that there's this parallel narrowing or flattening of identity onto some of these applications. I have a larger question, which is an open question for the group. And so whoever would like to pick it up first, but I hope to hear all of your opinions. So how does blockchain fit into the question of racial justice? Back to the theme of the conference. So how does it relate to racism and the history of racial exclusion, whether that be exclusion from general wealth creation, from institutional power, etc. So I'll let whoever feels ready pick up that.
I can start off just coming out of something that Elizabeth just said, which is that that kind of technological flattening and fixing of identity that takes place with blockchain type applications for identity partakes of a longer history that has to do with accounting technologies in general. And accounting technologies, I'm thinking like literally double entry bookkeeping, right? Were central in the formation of modes of capitalism and capital accumulation that depended on the fixing of people and place, such that people and places and resources could be extracted out of their environments and then put into a transactional environment. That's what accounting lets you do. I think of sort of Galen Rosenthal's Accounting and Slavery book, right? Going back to the accounts books of the plantation, or Ian Bowcom's work on insurance records and the slave trade, as things that are good to think with as we approach any sort of technologized system of accounting that tries to render people and places and things legible according to one sort of technological framework. So there's that component. There's another component that's fascinating to me as a sort of anthropologist who thinks about intellectual history and economic history, which is that the people who put together blockchain systems and the systems that they derived blockchain from themselves explicitly partake of Hayekian and Austrian school economics. So I think back to one of the things that we haven't brought up is the notion of proof of work. So in a blockchain system, there's an incentivization for a transaction verification to take place, whereby every one of those people in the town who's verifying the ledger is incentivized to do so by getting a little reward if they do so. But in order to play the game, they have to expend a certain amount of computational energy. That idea, that notion of proof of work, came about from a problem in the 90s around email spam. And Cynthia Dwork and Maurer kind of wrote this paper sort of proposing a solution to the problem of spamming, in which they propose adding a computational price to every piece of email that's sent. So if you want to send a piece of email, your server has to do just a little bit of extra useless work to get it out. For you and me, that's not a big deal, but for sort of industrial scale spammer, that's going to gobble up a lot of computational time and a lot of energy. And Dwork and Maurer explicitly framed this as a tragedy of the commons problem. And they cited Garrett Hardin, who wrote that famous essay on the tragedy of the commons, and said the only way to solve it is to just kind of get rid of it as a commons pool resource and put a price on it. So built into the code, built into the system, are these ideas about essentially neoclassical economic theory and a foreclosure of other kinds of economic possibility, like cooperativism or commons pool resources or some other kind of system of resource governance that would allow for different modes of participation. So for me, it's just interesting to slot those things, in their history and see them as part of processes of racial capitalism that we should just sort of be aware of as we approach these new technologies. It doesn't mean that they're tied to their roots, right? It doesn't mean that the legacy sets a path dependency and forever it shall be, but it's just something to kind of be aware of and realize there may be a constraint on the technological elimination by relying on systems that derive from very particular economic theories.
Great, thanks, Bill. Elizabeth, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, sure. So I remember when I first read Dr. Benjamin's work, and obviously she'll be keynoting tomorrow, it really struck me, having been in, in the sort of blockchain space for a number of years at that point, because there's a really powerful takeaway that I've taken from Dr. Benjamin's work, which is that racism is productive. And for me, this sort of light bulb went off in my head about the productive imperative of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, in the sense of trying to attach a sort of transactional component to all human and interpersonal interactions. And I found that quite problematic for a lot of reasons. But I think one is this framing of, productive, not in the sense of being good or beneficial, but literally productive, right? In the sense of extracting value. And the question became for me, who is this extracting value for? And I initially learned about cryptocurrencies in around 2011. And, I think like many people brush them off as sort of this very sci-fi kind of, dystopian thing that would never come to anything. But part of why I was so dismissive is because I saw who the sort of core developers were of these technologies, of the main ledgers of, certainly Bitcoin at the time, but even with Ethereum, when it sort of rose to popularity. And I just saw faces of white men. And, it was very off-putting, obviously, because I felt as though this was a wealth creation project for a single demographic. And that's obviously not where you see the industry today. You see a lot more, and I know we're going to get deeper into this, and there's some really good reports and research around diversity in the industry. But still, when it comes to sort of power and value extraction, a lot of these dynamics are still in place. And I think a lot of that comes from some of what Bill has just pointed to in terms of the origins of a lot of the technology and the sort of philosophical and ideological origins. There's no secret that Bitcoin was born out of a kind of anarchistic, libertarian, anti-governmental, anti-central bank kind of ethos in the wake of the financial crisis, and that it was fundamentally a hedge against society, right? It was sort of, Bitcoin will go up when society fails. And I think that kind of antisocial, hyper-individualistic, hyper-libertarian ethos and orientation, still has a strong hold over a lot of, we see this, today with the big crash, right? We see how, for me, I just didn't want to live in a world that was sort of betting against society. And I think that often, the institutions that the crypto and the blockchain and this industry is trying to undo are institutions that are really important to protect things like equity and to protect against concentrations of power, and to protect important communities, people, ideas, to just have a more inclusive view of the future and society. And I think this other question that always rings in my head that Dr. Benjamin asks is, whose future are we, or whose imagination are we forced to live in? And it feels as though since the origins of this industry were so explicit and so sort of singular in their approach and their ethos, we've sort of been forced into this game of catch up where, even people, myself included, where I feel my interest, this may be against my own interests, this may be against my own values, you're forced into this paradigm because of a certain momentum and path dependency that sets in, and then markets build around it. And then suddenly we're kind of, we find ourselves asking, how did we end up here? And do we have Dogecoin, and we have, a single individual able to wipe out, hundreds of millions of dollars from the market. So for me, it sort of goes back to this question of power. And so far, again, in my own experience, I've just seen a further concentration of power with sort of a superficial distribution of access and bold claims around things like democratization that haven't really panned out when you assess it from the point of view of power and control.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. Kortney, I'm wondering if you can chime in. I know that you do have a more optimistic take on blockchain and cryptocurrency in particular. Do you see this as, despite some of the issues that Bill and Elizabeth have laid out, as a technology that has the potential to redress histories of racial exclusion, especially from banking industries? Or can you give us a little bit more information on your take on this?
Yeah, thanks, Bill and Elizabeth. I agree with a lot, everything Elizabeth says, like the whole time I'm like, I know it's on spotlight mode, but my whole time I'm like, just nodding, because yeah, it's a super interesting, like space to be in. I find myself in the crypto space, having owned cryptocurrencies from the early 2000s, and got Dogecoin when it was free in a faucet. And so now I don't even know if that faucet still exists, because Dogecoin hit 75 cents last week. So, but there still are these really important questions of power, in terms of which Elizabeth is asking, like today, like a billionaire can manipulate the market that so many people have invested like hope in and money in, and because retail trading has taken off with the idea, which is, my mind is going so many ways, I'm sorry, but like this idea, right, where a couple of months ago that the little guy can stick it to Wall Street and can make a profit by social media, like shorting, like these collaborative efforts to move the market by the small people. And it happened with the GameStop stock, right? And this like Reddit group that like moved the market. But the people that are moving the market are still, like what Elizabeth said, like white men, the people who are developing coins, because anybody can develop a cryptocurrency. But in order to make that cryptocurrency valuable, you have to have buy-in literally from people wanting to either trade it or use it in some sort of manner. And so with that, you need like the power of a network to make that cryptocurrency valuable. Within the space, there still remains white men who are the wealthiest, have the most access, literally are whales and can move the market, and hurting small introductory retail traders who like, I'm going to buy Dogecoin and get rich. And then a billionaire throws a hissy fit and like that person loses their money. So there are all of those questions that are happening in crypto. At the same time, I do believe that decentralized finance could be a possible way for folks to really kind of redistribute wealth and create new economies of money. And I'm not a economic economist or in any way, shape, or form, but I do believe that like there are ways that we can move money around to redistribute wealth. And I think that there are people that are starting to do that utilizing crypto. We can talk about NFTs and ownership, and how now you can like have group ownership in something, digital assets. And what does that mean moving forward as we march closer to like a digital world where everything, like Elizabeth said, is becoming transactional. Our very person who we are is tied to a social media presence that is tied to payments. Everything is transactional now, or becoming that way. So what does that mean? I'm still very optimistic in, again, the utilities of DeFi, and potential uses of Bitcoin, and was inspired recently by last year when we were all in the house and watching global protests around the world against police brutality, like the NSARS protests. Young Nigerians collected Bitcoin to fund their protests because their government was restricting their bank accounts from getting funding from other people across the world. So there are like potential use cases that people have actually tried to in political moments, but in the space, who's creating the tokens, who is the wealthiest with this cryptocurrency, who has the ability to move the markets, they're not people who look like me. And so that raises significant questions about, is it a really, what does decentralized mean when someone can like tank the market overnight by a tweet? Like, what does that mean? Like how do we move forward with the utility of DeFi if most of the projects and ideas are focused on making the rich richer, rather than like kind of making the world more equitable for all? So I think we're still like super early in this space with DeFi in particular, and the applications toward it. And I think that as time moves on, there will be more people who are really thinking through these ways of kind of making the world more equitable using DeFi. I don't think that this is the moment now because everybody wants to get rich. And that's particularly what cryptocurrency is focused on right now, which is unfortunate. So I'm in the middle. I'm an optimist because of the technology, but I'm a realist about where we are. And I'm also pessimistic because of the power structure. So I hope that was the greatest.
Yeah. I'm very aware of the time. We are actually already 30 minutes in, and I have more questions for the three of you, and we do have some questions that are coming in on the chat. But I wanted to give you all a chance because we have a varied group of expertise and takes. If any of you had questions for each other before we start moving on to some from the audience.
If I could just jump in for a second and on something that Kortney just said, and this is not really a question, Kortney, just kind of a thing to think with. Like, I've been thinking a lot about how whether the terms that we use themselves set us up for certain kinds of traps. So just to take centralized and decentralized, like there are other models out there, right? There are other modes of governance, so to speak, other than centralized or decentralized. There's federated ones. I like to think a lot about cooperatives, and am inspired by the credit union system, which is right now working on questions of data governance and the possibility of data cooperatives to deal with the data that they've got, not just the money that they've got, right? These are things that are run for the profit of their members, not for a profit of a board or a CEO. This became very, important during COVID as people were seeing, record bank profits, and folks started to notice oh wait, credit unions, they work differently. And they're now thinking about working differently with data, right, on a similar kind of cooperative model. So I wonder, blockchain is one of these things that's there and has been doing certain kinds of work, and it's also been in the hands of certain kinds of people. But it might also open up a space for other kinds of work and other kinds of people to get involved using some of those alternative governance models. And that's just something I'd love to hear your reaction, but I don't know, Nina, if you need to move us along toward other questions.
No, let's keep the conversation going. So
That's
Kortney, Elizabeth, reactions?
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, because one of the things I'm actually doing right now, I'm part of a venture studio, and one of our goals is to build something that kind of offsets the excess cost of poverty. And so we're thinking through, one of the things that I'm thinking through is like these different modes that people have shared, or shared money or spent money, or like decided how to spend money, is super important. And that, like, decentralized finance in its current state, and who has, going back to the power structure, who is like kind of like in charge of developing in that space further, they're not kind of considering these alternative modes of interacting with money. And so I'm super fascinated and kind of like, oh man, there's so many other folks that have successfully done decentralized finance, which probably wouldn't be called decentralized finance in a number of ways. So I appreciate that point that you bring up, because I think a lot of us who kind of oscillate between these spaces of crypto and finance, and also kind of social justice in a lot of ways, don't remember to kind of connect the dots by that thinking. So that's my response. Thank you for that. And I would love to talk to you actually after to talk about what I'm building with my venture studio, since you're the money guy.
All right, that's always like what we want to see, right? Some positive connections coming out of these panels. So I'm wondering if this is also kind of open question, but if anyone would like to comment on this particular time. So of course, we've alluded to the recent crash of some of these cryptocurrencies, but also in relation to the pandemic, what's happening right now and how this might be pushing or encouraging some of these phenomena that we've been seeing grow over the past 10 years. So I know, Elizabeth, you've done some work on the proposed use of blockchain in immunity passports. Perhaps you'd like to touch on that, or if anyone else has comments, perhaps about political polarization and instability.
I can jump in. I mean, I think it is quite interesting that we're, roughly a decade post, I guess when most people would have learned around about Bitcoin, and we're, roughly a decade and more since, really the financial crisis and the fallout. But we're sort of back at a similar point in time where there's just tremendous fear and uncertainty. And you can sort of see a direct correlation, right, between, as fear and uncertainty go up, interest in things like blockchain and cryptocurrencies also goes up. And it makes sense, again, when you think about how these technologies are sort of rooted in a mistrust of conventional, traditional institutions. governments, but other institutions as well, large corporates. And so there's this sort of impulse towards this disintermediation. Now, of course, one of the things we've seen is that actually, in many ways, the industry has created more intermediaries than existed before, right? And it's also created large, concentrated, powerful corporations that are central points, not just a failure, but of sort of access and evading kind of inclusion and things like that. But the pandemic piece of it is, so there's sort of I think what's the fear and uncertainty, the sort of the right conditions for interest in these things. Then there's also the cross-border dynamic. And I think that one of the things that's also been appealing about the technology is the sort of, border agnostic nature in some ways, not in reality when it comes to law and regulation, but kind of the theory, at least, of an inherently cross-border or borderless technology where, as Bill outlined, there's this replication of a ledger or nodes across, different geographies, really can't be confined to a single place, and therefore has this sort of redundancy built into it from a geographic standpoint. But, and so with the pandemic, what we're finding is because, the world is locked down and because of the nature of a pandemic being everywhere, there's sort of an inherent interest in a technology that is borderless in that sense. And so with something like the vaccine passports, there's a sense that, okay, if they're going to be leveraged in something like travel, well, that's sort of, we need something that works across borders and that can be interoperable across borders. And so there's interest in it. But again, I think the problem with it is that it's fundamentally, at the end of the day, a digital identity use case for this, right? That is what a vaccine passport is. And again, if you think about why blockchain is typically, or what it's typically sort of celebrated for, what people get really excited about, it's properties like transparency, traceability, efficiency, right? But if you think about people, you don't want people to be transparent and traceable and efficient, right? You don't want to apply these properties to people unless you're a totalitarian or authoritarian regime. And then it's a dream use case, right? Because then that's exactly what you want your people to be. So, and similarly with things like censorship resistance. So people talk about that as a positive. But really in blockchain, what that means is that no one can prevent you from, proposing a transaction to be written to a ledger. Depending on the ledger, obviously it varies. But what we're losing sight of is that with humans, we want to be mutable and changeable. We want to be able to have different identities, contextualize those identities. We want to be able to reinvent ourselves. We want to be able to, if we're in certain geographies where there are concerns about persecution or other sort of human rights concerns, we're actually making ourselves more vulnerable by attaching something like identity to what is a transparent, traceable, immutable record of transactions effectively. So each time you sort of look at a specific principle or trait and you break it down and you apply it in a given context, and the pandemic being a really good example, at the end of the day, are those the qualities that you want when thinking about how to mediate, the human experience and the way we go through the world? And, for me, it's a really dystopian end. And this is why, we see, it's so interesting to me how we see so much criticism of China and its central bank digital currency and some of the things it's doing with blockchain distributed ledger, where we're quite quick to call that surveillance technology, but actually the same tools are being built and used by plenty of parties outside of China, and we don't frame them or view them that way. And so I just worry that that there is kind of we can obscure kind of what's really happening with some of this terminology. So perhaps it is, to Bill's point, that how we talk about these things really matters. And equally, I think this sort of centralized, decentralized thing is also a red herring, right? I mean, if you stake everything in a single ledger and the network goes down, that's the single point of failure. It doesn't matter. There are so many ways to sort of, it's just very hard to take these terms at face value. And so again, think about the principles, basic principles: accounting technology, transparency, traceability, immutability. Do you want that to apply to humans? I don't. And so that's that. When you get down to the basics, that's sort of what I go back to. And I think the easiest way to think about it.
All right, does anyone else have a comment on this historical moment, either in parallel to something from the past, or if you see this as a kind of rupture, a fundamental change in the way people are thinking about and using blockchain?
I was just doing a little applause there for Elizabeth. Just to one other little thing to add, though, in terms of like historical context that we might forget, because I mean, for most of us here who are assembled in this space right now, we're on like Zoom or we're watching something streaming, so we have internet, we have electricity, blah blah blah. We do need to remember the deep exclusionary tendencies of like banking, finance, and tech, which I think we talked a little bit about. Another thing that we forget about sometimes, because like for me, stuff tends to work when I want to do anything with money, is just how kludgy those systems are behind the scenes. And one of the reasons why blockchain has gotten a lot of lift, both after the global financial crisis and again now during COVID, when people saw various forms of breakdown of payment systems and relief distribution systems, for example, is just how slapped together a lot of our legacy systems for money, banking, and finance are. And that's why, it takes, several days for certain kinds of transactions to clear. For me, it doesn't really matter, but it might matter if I was unbanked, if I didn't have access to a bank account. One of the things that we saw during COVID is, folks who had gotten assistance preparing their taxes and filing digitally, who did not have bank accounts, so they're going to a library, right, and like to a clinic, and someone's helping them file their taxes, got relief payments in the form of emailed echecks, and they don't have a bank account, right? So what do? They have to go to the library, print out that email, then they take a printed out e-check to a check cashing outlet where they're assessed a bunch of fees and a bunch of money is taken right off the top. And it's easy to kind of forget those things, but that's the experience of a ton of people in this country, and it's even more generalized around the world. So even though a lot of our systems seem to work, behind the scenes they're very slapped together, bubblegum and glue and wire. So there are opportunities here for making some of these things better, given some of the serious issues and concerns that Elizabeth just raised. I just want to remind us, like, our systems are really kludgy, that's all.
I just want to say, wow, I didn't know that about the printing out of e-checks for people to get the funding that other people got directly to a bank account, or even if they didn't have a bank account, a cash app, virtual bank account kind of thing. And that is I'm blown away, because it's like there are many potential use cases, I think, for technology and money, and making it easier for people to access money and get money and share money, with the reality that it's still extremely difficult for people to to access cash. Like, even if it's giving cash directly to them, it's still like having to print out, going to a library during the pandemic when libraries were even closed. Like, I'm just thinking about, where did people even go if the library that they had to access wasn't closed, or they didn't have access to a printer, and Kinko's is no longer a thing. So it's like, where did, super interesting. And thank you for bringing that point to the panel, because I think sometimes we get so advanced talking about like in the future almost, when the reality is that, like, you're right, the current financial systems that people who have limited resources that are accessing are to their detriment. And I'm thinking about, like, man, like having to take a physical check to a check cashing place who is, you're right, taking out more fees from the small amount that folks already got during the pandemic is mind-blowing. So, and frustrating to hear. So thank you for sharing that point.
So we're having a couple requests for resource recommendations. So I'm hoping we can just do like a quick whip around. If each of you can just recommend, one or two essential reading points for folks who are looking to learn more about some of the themes we've been talking about today.
I think one of the most important works, I think, on this is The Politics of Bitcoin by David Columbia.
Yep, that's a great one. Another one would be Lana Swartz's New Money. Is that what it's called? How Money Became Social Media, I think. Lana Swartz, Swartz.
That was the one I was going to recommend. Like, exactly.
Okay, we've got two for Lana. You can all feel free to plug your own work too, if you want to take this moment.
I mean, so I just got this in the mail today. This is the Handbook of Digital Anthropology, new edition, and I'm in it with a chapter on blockchain. So
Yeah,
there you
that's
go.
awesome.
Perfect. Okay, well, I hope that some of those in the audience will be able to access those resources. Access to academic resources is another equity issue that I'm sure we could spend a lot of time touching upon. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I will either allow each person to speak freely, something that you wanted to say today that you haven't had a chance to, and if you can't think of that, maybe one point that you would make to someone who is thinking about potentially getting involved or investing in some of these technologies. What would you want to say to them that they should know before moving forward?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think what's been so interesting for me about this conversation today is it's just such another clear demonstration that just introducing a new technology on top of very broken structures doesn't fix any of the underlying problems in terms of equity or inclusion. In fact, it often just exacerbates the situation. So I think it's really important to resist some of the narratives, very pronounced narratives in this industry around techno-solutionism and kind of determinism, and to sort of understand that this project of automating everything, right, of this computational kind of framing has an inherent, has a politics attached to it, has sort of values embedded in it, and that for me, it would be really interesting to have new people come into the space and challenge some of those underlying framings and some of those underlying values, because the technology, theoretically could be deployed towards other ends. And, Kortney's mentioned many of those, and those are sort of, very valuable ends, and yet invaluable not in the sense of the sort of commercial value, but, societally sort of collectively valuable. However, if you start from the same sort of basic assumptions and framing that sort of been the history of the industry, then I think there is a real concern that it's hard to break free of that and hard to reimagine a different outcome or a different future. So I think it's really this exercise in imagination, and also appreciating that there's so much of the underlying societal, cultural, political infrastructure that is in many ways so much more important than the technology that's going to determine how it's ultimately leveraged and how it ultimately impacts on things like power. And the final thing I'll say is that at the moment, only about 4 to 5% of all people in this industry are women. And there is, there are gender dimensions, there are racial dimensions, there are geographic dimensions. Less than 10% of all teams have at least one female founder on them. But it's not just this inclusion, it's not just the sort of superficial, measurable DEI stuff. It's power, right? It ultimately comes down to power and control. And so pushing back against those assumptions to challenge those who hold the power and control right now is really the key to a potentially more optimistic future around this.
That's great. Thank you, Elizabeth. I think we can all agree.
I think it's a great place to end on, because I think I'm not going to speak for Bill, but I would probably say something similar, that these kind of technology is great. Technology is not the end all be all to solve. Some of the problems are definitely deeper than that, and require really critical ways of addressing them, other than just saying, let's just slap some Bitcoin on top, which is really interesting in the Bitcoin community. Like, people, the last year, the world is collapsing. It's okay, buy Bitcoin. It's like, how? What is that? Does that erase like racial inequality? It's like, no, it doesn't. Like, but there are people that generally just believe that technology, no matter what, slapping on something is gonna solve the problem. And so I think it's really important that we do the things that Elizabeth says to do in this space if you're operating kind of like, to use your imagination in a different way, but also recognize the root causes of why things are the way they are. So.
Yeah, just to end on that imagination point, I think, and bring it back to Ruha Benjamin. I mean, there's this important work that needs to be done to really examine the limits of our imaginative horizon and be aware of those limits. And maybe that's a thing that I say because I was trained in anthropology, right? Which is always trying to get you beyond that horizon. But in this kind of context, it also means going back into the kind of axiomatic assumptions of a computational system and asking the question, how are those axioms constraining the imagination and thereby constraining what we build? So, I encourage and exhort, the computer scientists listening to really think deeply about the axiomatic assumptions of your craft and imagine how they could be different.
Great, thank you to all of our panelists. I think the purpose of this conference as a whole, is to emphasize the extent to which all technology is political. And for what it's worth, blockchain does not attempt at all to camouflage the political nature. If anything, it foregrounds it. So we can also take this as a starting point to think through the ways in which power is imbricated in all sorts of technological applications. So with that, I also encourage you all to stay with us for the rest of the event. And tomorrow we will have Dr. Ruha Benjamin herself for the keynote at 4 p.m. Thank you.